Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Old South Meeting House. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Erica Lindemood. I'm the Education Director here. We're very pleased to welcome you all this evening to a talk by Sandy Oliver titled, "Is It True What They Say About Lobster?" Sandy founded the Fireplace Cooking Program at Mystic Seaport Museum and has been working as a food historian ever since. Her publications include Saltwater Foodways and Food in Colonial and Federal America. Her weekly column, Taste Buds, appears in the Bangor Daily News. And I ask you to now join me in giving a warm welcome to Sandy Oliver.
Thank you, Erica. Well, I think we ought to start where we all live. I'd like to know your favorite ways to eat lobster. So how about in the rough? Raise your hands if you like in the rough. Not as many as I would have thought. Okay. All right. Pardon? Oh, I'm sorry. That means you sit down at a picnic table and you claw your way into them after they've just been pulled out of the pot. And it runs down your elbows and stuff like that, and you cut your fingers on all little sharp places yeah, that's in the rough. How many like it in the rough? Yeah, a few. Oh, well, okay, now that you know what it is. Oh, yeah. Okay, how about lobster stew? That interesting concoction that has no vegetables in it. It's only lobsters, and it's only cream. It's delectable. Okay. How about Jasper White's lobster and corn chowder? No. Oh my goodness. All right. It's really, really good. If you're ever out of the Summer Shack, you can get it there, or you can just make it. It's in lots of cookbooks now. It's a nice way to have it. All right. How about lobster bisque then? You have to be polite. The maker's sitting right. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's a pretty good way to do it. How about just out of its shell and sitting in a nice little pot, like a lobster salad or a lobster roll? Have any of you ever eaten at Red's in Wiscasset? Any of you ever go to Maine? Besides my friend.
Where's Wiscasset?
In Wiscasset, Red's Eats, right on the corner. Down by the water. It's a famous Maine lobster roll place, and the claim is that every lobster roll has a whole lobster in it. And you can get it a couple of different ways, and one is merely in a nice little toasted split top roll with butter dribble on it. I won't stand in line for lobster. There's always this huge line. So I've never eaten there myself, but I hear tell it's really good. All right, well, now I'm going to talk about the truth about lobsters, and I just would like to say that I find often people go away from this discussion somewhat distressed. But I want you to understand that when I first started doing lots of research on seafood eating in New England, I kept bumping into stuff that didn't match up with my expectations about lobster. And I sort of had this moment of, what's going on here anyhow? Why is it not the way I thought it was? So what I'd like to do this evening is share with you that, some of the things I bumped into, what I discovered, that are variants with a lot of our preconceived notions or some of the stories we've all heard, right? So, you all have heard, right, that apprentices refuse to eat lobster more than twice a week, right? Or you may have heard that they use lobsters as fertilizer, or they fed it to pigs. You may have heard that famous thing that Winthrop said, an apology, that all they had to serve guests who may have come to, who stopped by the colony, was lobster and water and no bread. And our heart goes out to him until we realize that they didn't have enough cows to make butter, to get cream to make butter to put on the lobster, so the lobster probably wasn't that good, right? Because what's lobster without butter or mayonnaise or something of that sort? You may have heard that the lobsters were so plentiful that you could merely walk along the shore and just snag one and pick it up and take it home and boil it, right? Do any of these things sound even remotely familiar? Yeah, okay, so you've heard all this stuff, right? Okay. And you go to Maine, and you can add to that a few other really tantalizing little items, and one of those is that school children living on the coast of Maine were sometimes embarrassed to take lobster sandwiches to school. They would vastly have preferred a bologna sandwich. That families sometimes ate an awful lot of lobster, and what they really would have liked was hamburger and maybe hot dogs. And that would have been in the 20th century even. So there's a lot of these stories, and so we get this interesting notion that perhaps at one time lobsters were not very well esteemed at all, perhaps even shunned a little bit. And we say, oh, don't they know how good lobster is? How could they have said these things? How could they have treated lobster that way? It's a luxury food, and we think it's wonderful. Well, let's take a little bit closer look at that. What do we know about lobster in early America? We ought to start with right here in New England. Our first settlers knew lobsters. There is a European lobster, as you may know, but you come to America, and good old Homarus americanus is this great big creature, lots bigger claws. They're lots meatier. But the English settlers recognized, they knew a lobster when they saw one, and there they were, and they said, wow, look at that, these are really big. In fact, Reverend Francis Higginson in Salem in 1630 writes, the least boy in the plantation may both catch and eat what he will of them. For my own part, I was soon cloyed with them. They were so great and fat and luscious. I have seen some myself that have weighed 16 pounds, but others have divers times so great lobsters that have weighed 25 pounds, as they assure me. Sounds like a fish story to me. But yes, I mean, those early lobsters, having not been fished very much, attained great age and size. Obviously, Higginson ate some. He seemed to enjoy them, but he soon cloyed of them, he says. Interesting. In Peter Kalm, visiting in North America in the 1740s, visited in New York City, and he saw lobsters for sale there. Actually, what he saw were lobster, what we would now call a lobster car. The lobsters, as you know, are really perishable creatures. They don't thrive out of water for very long at all. That's why when you go in the grocery store, you see them swimming in these tanks and crawling all over each other and all. So you really have to keep them in water or cook them right away. So Peter Kalm is walking on the New York waterfront, and he sees lobsters in cars floating in water. These are they're just a tank, slatted side crate in the water, and the lobsters are in there. Those lobsters were being caught and taken to New York City from Long Island Sound. They were being fished along the Connecticut shore and carried to New York for sale in well smacks. Are you familiar with the term well smack? This is a vessel that has part of its hull partitioned off from the rest of it, and there's holes drilled through, so there's a fresh supply of water coming and going through the hull. And the lobsters, and other fish as well, were sometimes carried to market in this circulating water. And that, obviously the goal here is getting that fresh seafood and good condition all the way from Connecticut or even Cape Cod down to New York. I'm hoping that you're asking yourself the question, well, if nobody liked lobsters, why were they bothering to carry them to New York live in well smacks? Why would Peter Kalm or anybody else have seen lobsters for sale if nobody thought they were any value? George Brown Good in the 1880s, assembled a massive history of the fisheries in America. And he, of course, dedicates a section of his history of the fisheries, history and method of the fisheries, in his massive book. And he reports that there was a lobster dealer here in Boston, a fellow named Benjamin Simpson, who had a restaurant in the basement of his house at the South End. And he used to go out in the harbor, according to Good, in a little boat. He would catch them in the vicinity of Castle Fort, and then he'd peddle them around the city. Now, I hope he was walking quickly and got these lobsters to housewives before they had expired very long. There were others who fished inshore. I mean, they were doing this, they were right along the shore, in a small boat, you could do that. But it didn't take very long for these folks to figure out that probably it was best to get them ashore, get them into a cauldron, boil them up, and then peddle them in a boiled state. That way you didn't have some housewife picking it up and snapping the tail to see if it curled back quickly enough, which is a sign of a fresh, lively lobster. You can try this out at the Stop and Shop too, or wherever it is you go. If you pick up the lobster and it just kind of does that, you just put it back. Don't waste your time. You want one that thrashes around and snaps its tail back and forth. And if he doesn't do it, you don't want him. So they were being peddled. They were being used. They were valuable. In fact, they were valuable enough that we ate our way through the local lobster supply. At least all the inshore lobsters were gone. And in order to keep up this supply, sure enough, people were coming as far as Maine to get lobster. Yeah. This was in the 1840s. I'm sorry. Yes, let's move into the 1840s. Early 1800s, we had just about fished out alongshore in southern New England, where the population was more dense. And they were going to Maine to get lobsters. Right in Penobscot Bay, where I live, well smacks were coming up from Boston and buying caught lobsters from fishermen, lobstermen in Penobscot Bay, and carrying them all the way back to Boston. If lobsters were not valued, why this long voyage all the way down east to get lobsters to take back to the city? I hope you're asking yourself that question. So it was a valuable fishery. So what did people do with the lobsters? Well, interestingly enough, hardly anybody ever ate them in the rough. Cooks usually picked the meat out of the lobster, put it in a sauce, and they used it for a better fish, like, say, cod or haddock. Sometimes lobster was incorporated into a pie, a seafood pie of some sort, given some structure. One thing about the 19th century, and actually even earlier, is that at least our culture, the Anglo-American culture, doesn't like little messes on a plate for an important meal. We don't like little piles of unruly food. We like form. We like a roast. We like a boiled joint. We like something that makes a statement on the table. Well, a lobster would make a statement if you plunked it on the table, but not the right kind of statement. And once you get it out of the shell, then you have a mess. So you got to do something with that lobster that gives it some form. You could put it in a pie. If you're not going to use it for a sauce, you might put it in a pie, because then the pie becomes the statement on the table. You cut it in, and there's all this lovely lobster in there. In the middle of the 1800s and towards the later 1800s, one way to handle this little mess problem was for the cook to clean out the claws and the tail and all, and keep the tail in good condition. You're going to clip all of you keep the firm part intact, and then they just sort of cut away all of the softer part of the bottom side of the tail. And then they take the meat and they would mix it with breadcrumbs and some seasonings, add some butter and so forth, and they pack it back in this nice little tail. Now this made a very genteel presentation at the table, and it had the further virtue of something you could eat with a fork. Victorians did not eat with their fingers. They just accepted at picnics, where they did eat lobsters and clams and other things, but that was outdoors. That was sort of like fun. It's sort of like eating hot dogs, by the shore. It's fun food. You would never put that on your dining table, but you might take your lobster, you might put it in a little vol au vent, you might put it in this, back in its own shell and present it, but you had to be able to eat it with a fork. So, lobster was valuable. In fact, it was valuable enough that if you couldn't, as the 19th century progresses and more lobsters available in tiny little cans that you opened up, and you could use that lobster meat in salads. You could make sandwiches out of it. You could do a lot. You could use it lots of different ways. The fishery began to support canneries. The Maine coast was just chock full of little canneries. Every little tiny towns had little canneries, and lots of lobster found their way into the canneries as part of the seasonal, a changing run of different kinds of food, including some vegetables, other kinds of sardines and all kinds of other things, but certainly lobsters as well. So lobster was valuable stuff. If it was valuable enough to put in a can and ship it around the country, which they did in the later 19th century, you could buy canned lobster from New England, in the Midwest, the West, and people did. So it was valuable stuff. Well, did everybody like it? Well, no, of course not. Not everybody liked lobster. In fact, I have this couple of fun little quotes. There's a fellow who wrote a book about the market, Peter Felker, 1878. He was doing an encyclopedia of all the kinds of things that you might find in marketplaces, including seafood markets and butcher shops and all the rest of them. And he said about lobsters, they are common in the markets, especially in spring and summer, and are considered a great delicacy, though the meat is rather indigestible. There was a fellow down in Mystic, not too far from where I started my food history career, a fellow named Captain Thomas Fairfax, and he owned a smack, Mary Lane, and he said, lobsters are very good as an article of commerce and pretty enough to look at, but after they're biled, but as to eating them, I prefer cast-off rubber shoes. Well, they weren't, so I guess they were not universally popular. Lobsters even found their way into the life-saving service under some circumstances. Some of you may know that at one time the U.S. government established life-saving stations all along the most treacherous parts of New England's coast. Well, in fact, around the Great Lakes and all up and down the sea, the Atlantic seaboard, but all around Block Island and Cape Cod and places like that where there were a lot of shipwrecks. There were life-saving stations every few miles or so, and patrols would go up and down the coast. There was one on Fisher's Island, which is part of New York State, in 1920. The crew there had a cook who got lobsters from a local lobsterman, and the cook did this. He served the lobster usually as a salad and used a large white platter about 4 feet long and a foot or 15 inches wide. When he got the bushel or so of lobsters cooked and picked out, he would put all the meat on the platter and garnish it with parsley and lemon slices all around the edges. To us hooligans, the whole thing looked like something from Delmonico's or the Parisian Parfait. Tom was a neat picker, and he got out all the small claw meat and used that green stuff around the head, too. 1920s, Coast Guard service guys eating lobster salad, pretty elegant. I hate to think how many lobsters have died from weddings. In the late 1800s, the standard fare for a great many weddings was chicken salad and lobster salad. Women in communities got together and just picked out dozens and dozens and dozens of lobsters, made the meat into salad, mixed it with a little bit of celery, a boiled icing of some, boiled dressing of some sort or another, mixed in, and everybody scoops up some and put it on their plate for the bride and groom. So, looks to me like lobster was worth catching. Looks to me like it was valuable enough fare. Let's just go back and kind of revisit some of these stories that say it was so poorly esteemed. Let's start with one of the early, very often people say to me, well, didn't Governor Bradford say, and yes, he did. He said this. He said, all that the colonists could present their friends with was a lobster without bread or anything else but a cup of fair water. This was in 1622. Well, what was that all about? Culinary historians down at Plymouth Plantation say, no, this is not a slam against lobster. It's merely a statement of fact that the settlers in Plymouth, the colonists in Plymouth, just were at a stage of their early settlement where that was it. That's what they had. They were doing subsistence living. They had no cattle. They had no pigs yet. They had, in fact, they hadn't even gotten around to planting and harvesting enough wheat to make bread. They certainly didn't have enough extra grain to go around brewing their preferred beer or ale from. So they were drinking water and lobster, and as I pointed out a little earlier, there was no butter to put on the lobster. It was subsistence. So this comment of his was a statement of fact that this is where they were at the time. Now, what happens very often in the first 5 to 10 years of settlement, while settlers are trying to save their cattle for increase, you don't eat them right away. You might start eating the pigs because pigs are so prolific, and you can eat one and have quite a bit of meat, and still there's quite a few more pigs in the litter to save for an increase in the total group. But that's not true with cattle. Cattle breed more slowly, and so it takes a lot longer to get around to that roast beef, which is what they really, really wanted. Good roast beef, a good mug of beer, a good loaf of good old white bread, wheat bread. It's what they preferred. In fact, it's what we prefer, right? Hamburger and a roll and a bud. There it is. So it's true, that's what he said. But we have to understand it in the context that he meant it. What about some of these other stories that we hear? What about this whole business of the fertilizer, using lobsters as fertilizer, letting pigs eat it? Well, as our fellow from Mystic in the Noank area of Connecticut observed, lobsters were pretty good as an article of commerce. In fact, Noank had a pretty active cannery. And the cannery, after they had picked the lobster out of the shells, either gave or sold very cheaply all the shells that people could use on their garden as compost it. In Noank, a lot of the housewives used to throw the shells out for their chickens to eat, and that one diary keeper observed that they could always tell when the chickens had been eating lobster shells because the yolks got a pinkish cast to them from the bright red boiled shell. In Maine, there's an article written by a fellow traveling up from New York City, writing for Atlantic Magazine or one of those. And he was saying, oh my God, these rubes, they don't know the value of lobster. You go down the road, this is in the middle and later 1800s. He said, you see lobster shells in the field. These people are plowing lobster into their fields. You know, what he didn't see was the cannery over the hill. The cannery was so glad when farmers came and took away wagon loads full of these shells and used them, spread them on the fields. Apparently, this still happens in some places, that people still gather lobster shells from canneries or lobster pounds, anywhere where a lot of shells are being generated, and they use them for compost. And I do myself. I had couple of years ago, I had some pigs, and we did a lobster bake. And I threw my lobster shells down. The pigs loved it, and I went out in the afternoon, and I was watching my pigs, and one of them was running around with a carapace stuck on his nose, just like this. It's like he had a lobster mask on. He was running around. Happy pigs, bark, and they're very cheerful, and they really love their lobster. But this one was wearing a carapace. It was so cute. And I compost them too. It's amazing how quickly lobster shell breaks down in the garden. Every once in a while, I'll come across a bit of claw after I've turned all this stuff into the ground, but the rest of it disappears. It's gone by, especially if it's new shells. Do you know about the difference between new? All right, let's do new shells. That's a euphemism for soft shells, or what some people in Maine call shedders. Part of the life cycle of the lobster is the lobsters will crawl off, find some nice, safe rock, and they get rid of their old shell, and they kind of exist in a jelly-like state for a little while until their new shell starts coming back. And when their new shell comes on, then they find it safe enough to walk out, and they go and they crawl into traps, and sometimes they get fished out of the water. Actually, a lot of lobstermen, at least some of the ones I know, claim that they're not actually fishing for lobster, they're sort of raising them. They say they put lobster in those traps, and the lobsters come in and they eat and they crawl out, and they come back and they eat some more and they crawl out. One day they can't leave because they've just gotten too big. But starting along July, early August, we get a lot of soft shells, which the Lobster Council markets as new shells, because no one would want to eat something that's like a soft shell. I don't like soft shells. The only way I like soft shells is if I have to pick it out for a salad or making lobster stew or lobster mac and cheese or something like that, because then it's easy. You just go like that with a claw and it pops right open. Of course, water, they're watery inside. They go squirt this way, squirt that way, and it makes a big mess all over. But a lot of people they say, well, no, the lobster meat is so much more tender. Well, it's tender, yeah, but I'd rather have the hard shell where you have the lobster is tight to his own shell or her own shell, and it's firm and sweet. I really personally, I prefer the hard shells. Where was I? I got on that whole rant about soft shells. Well, I'll think of something.
I have a quick question.
Pardon?
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
On the canned lobster that you were talking about,
Mm-hmm.
and that was back when, in the 1800s or 1700s?
Yes, 1840s. The question was about canned lobster.
So did they have some kind of preservative in it, or what did they use?
Oh, no, no preservative, no. They just packed it in and they did the canning, which itself is a preserving method. Yeah, no preservatives had to be added to it. Yeah. That's not to say that there weren't way of preserving lobsters. They were sometimes pickled, as were oysters and sometimes mussels as well, pickled in vinegar. No. Pardon me? No, cooked. They were cooked and then pickled. It sounds dreadful, but I guess one would get taste for it. Oh, I know. We were talking about fertilizer. We were talking about lobsters as fertilizer. So, but you can see where that story comes from. It really has to do with the cannery around the corner, which is selling all of its shells. All right. I have hunted high and low to find, I like primary sources. You know, I just like primary sources. So I went looking for evidence that anybody like a prisoner or a lumberman or in the town poor or apprentices or anybody else like that refused to eat lobster more than twice a week. I couldn't find it anywhere. In fact, I took a look at the ordinances governing what prisoners in Boston were actually fed in the 1850s. And they had a system of rations, and it had salt pork, salt beef, potatoes, bread, you know, codfish in a regular rotation, and then, you know, something special on Sunday. No lobster anywhere. It just isn't there. There's no evidence anywhere. But this keeps coming up all the time. You hear this story. Whenever where there's smoke, there has to be fire. Where would these kinds of stories come from? Well, the only thing that I've ever heard that sounded the least bit plausible was apparently in England in the 1700s, the Fishmongers' Guild finally developed a rule that forbade their members from feeding their apprentices with fish more than a specified number of times every week. Now, I thought, oh, well, now this makes some sense, because if you were a fishmonger and you had a fish that you know is about to go over the hill, you're going to feed it to the first person you got, you know, who can't say no to you, right? So that made some sense. I thought, okay, I get that. That may be all of the smoke behind this whole story of the prisoners or the apprentices, the blah, blah, blah. But I'll tell you that the thing that really just knocked my socks off on this was that these stories about feeding them and people refusing to eat them, was never told about lobsters until the 20th century. It was never told about lobsters until the 20th century. Before the 20th century, the same story, these same refusal stories, were told about salmon. It was told about salmon. The boarding house inhabitants in Lowell, Massachusetts, the people on the poor farm on Islesboro, Maine, lumbermen in the Pacific Northwest, you name it. They all turned that salmon down. We're not eating salmon more than twice a week, you know? Salmon. And you know what? It's not true about salmon either. Again, there was no primary evidence that any of these stories were actually true. There's no ordinances, there's no minutes from the indignation meeting that I can find. It was, these stories crop up most often in town histories. In the later part of the 1800s, there were a lot of busy beavers out there cranking out town histories to beat the band. And the story about the salmon was very often told in the context of mind-boggling plenty. The salmon were so thick in Penobscot Bay that you could walk across the Caspian on the backs of them, and yet the town poor refused to eat salmon more than twice a week. Blah, 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 blah. So you always have these, and why did these come up? Well, because by the later 1800s, so many rivers had been dammed in Maine and all of New England to provide water power for factories, that the numbers were diminishing because they could no longer run up the rivers and spawn as they had been. And so salmon were getting rarer, more valuable. So people stopped fretting about salmon in the early 1900s, but lobsters were getting more valuable. And so lobsters get stuck with this same story about the refusal to eat. Now it is true, and I've heard this from old-timers whose veracity I completely trust, that you didn't want to take lobster salad to sandwiches to school. You really wanted to have a bologna sandwich. Now, what's that about? Well, if lobsters have a market, then they have value. when there is no market for lobsters, then they're perfectly useless items. If a lobsterman in Maine can't find a buyer for the lobster, what's he going to do with it? He's going to cook it up and feed it to his family. And if Reverend Francis Higginson could get sick and tired of eating lobster, well, so could a Maine lobsterman's family, and they do, and they did. And the kids would much rather have had bologna because that showed you had cash, that you didn't have to. You weren't doing subsistence living. You didn't have to get lobsters. You didn't have to dig clams. You didn't have to eat fish that you caught yourself. You had some actual money. You could go down to Durkee's Market and you could buy some bologna. You could afford to buy hot dogs. It showed you had money. And having money was preferable to eating lobster sandwiches. And kids would go to school and trade. They still do, of course, but hey, trade you half of my lobster salad, half of that bologna sandwich. I've heard this so many different times that I really do think it's true. And old timers telling me that my mother would say, we're eating a lot of chowder these days, but you don't have to, clam chowder, but you don't have to tell anybody that this is what we're doing. It was a survival strategy. It was just to get you through a tough spot until the market reasserted itself and you had finally a way of getting rid of all those lobsters that you had caught. Lobster pounds in Maine in the later 1800s, early 20th century. They were coves. Very often coves were kind of dammed off, and rusticators come up and they get lobsters. They're plunked right into a boiling pot, and then you go and sit on the shore somewhere and eat the lobsters. People from away loved eating lobster. They really held it. It was part of a special part of your vacation coming to the shore. I'm sure that was true on Cape Cod. Shore dinners all up and down Cape Cod, the Connecticut shoreline featured lobster. Lobster was valuable stuff, and all of those kinds of enterprises created a market for it. But at the end of the season, even now, actually about this time of year, most of the lobstermen I know who work off Islesboro are starting to pull their traps and empty out their cars. If they can't find, the summer people are all going to Florida, and the island is our island is emptying out. It's getting really quiet. I can cross the road without looking both ways on my way to the mailbox, and I can get lobster. I can get lobster much less expensively right now. So because there's just a less adequate market for it. Now is when, the local people buy lobster, and we boil it up and we pick it out and we put it and freeze it in milk. I freeze it in milk and stick it in the freezer. On Christmas Eve, I have lobster stew. And it's pretty darn good. And the poor lobstermen, Actually, this has been a good season. The price of fuel has gone down. The price of lobster came up a little bit. A couple of years ago, we had a terrible season and it was really hard for the lobstermen to make a decent living. Cost of bait went up. It was a tough time this past year. Pretty good year for lobstermen. I don't think I bought lobster for anything cheaper than $5 a pound. And at one point this summer, I had to pay as much as $5.50 a pound, right directly from a local guy who fishes for it. So the lobster, with any kind of luck, lobster will continue as something of a luxury food. I'm going to be really, really interested to know, and I won't be around to observe it, unfortunately, but in 100 years from now, I would just love to know what it is that we're eating now that people in the future will say, you couldn't serve this to your nanny more than twice a week, or you couldn't, you couldn't pawn this off to your electrician's helper, or whatever it is they come up with. What is it that we're enjoying now that will be less well regarded in the future? I would love to know.
I wondered if there was lobster served at the Thanksgiving, American Thanksgiving Day dinner Pilgrims had in Plymouth.
They serve lobster down
Did
there?
they?
Yeah. Oh, for their
For their,
for their settlers?
right,
Not the 19th century one, but the earlier one.
right.
Yeah. Well, they're making some they're surmising the presence of lobster. That first Thanksgiving, which they didn't call the event of 1622. Yeah. The only thing that we know for sure that was absolutely for dead certain served at that meal was venison, because Massasoit and his men went out and they brought back, I think it was 4 deer. So that's the only thing, and the fowl. The men went fowling, so, what, ducks, geese, something, what fowl, wildfowl, turkey, who knows? Of course, most modern people would like to think there was turkey there, because we're doing that too. But so they're presuming any amount of shellfish that could still be harvested, because this meal could have occurred as early as October. It's perfectly reasonable to think about going out and digging some clams, picking mussels, and catching lobsters. So possibly, yeah.
What does your research tell you that the early lobster eaters did with the tamale and the roe?
Do people like to eat tamale? How many people like eating tamale? Yeah, you like it, huh? Yeah, I won't eat tamale because that's the lobster's liver, and if there's going to be any junk in the water, it's going to end up in the tamale. But the roe, I like the roe a lot. In fact, I'll take the roe out special. If I'm making a lobster salad, for example, I take the roe out, set it aside, and make sure that I break it all up and mix it with the mayonnaise to get that pretty color. It's really wonderful stuff. Yeah, roe's good. Was that what you asked?
My question was, what did your research tell you?
Oh, they ate the whole thing. Yeah, they ate all that stuff. Yeah. The guys on at the Coast Guard station, Tom the cook used that green stuff around the head. It's flavorful as all get out. It really is. So I see why. I mean, and people in past times, I'm sure, sucked out the legs. Picked out every little bit. When you take the leg, there's a little nugget at the base of all the legs. It's worth going through very carefully. Oh yeah. Oh no, I don't know about that. I don't think so. I don't think they ate the antenna. Oh, the muscles at the base of that. Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot of good stuff in a lobster.
Did I understand correctly that you said lobster were everywhere, all up and down the New England coast?
Mm-hmm.
Is that
That's
still
right.
the case? Are they still? I only associate them with Maine.
Yes, and of course, where I live is a really, really productive place. Penobscot Bay is famous for being extremely productive grounds. But yeah, there's quite a few lobsters up and down. The lobster fishery was valuable enough that has been very well managed, often by the lobstermen themselves, who realized pretty early on that if they didn't control the harvest, there would be no more lobster. So when female over a certain size gets a notched tail, anybody pulls one out, check the notch back into the water. Buried females, ones who have the eggs on them, go right back in. You can't harvest a lobster till it gets to be a certain size. You have to let them grow a while. There's a lot of regulation, and there's a lot of, I'm sure you've all heard all the territorial stories about the lobstermen protecting their fishery grounds, and it can be pretty rugged. I've heard stories about what are called bouquets being created, where an invading lobsterman tries to set its traps too close into another town's territory. Usually the fishermen, and they call themselves fishermen. They don't say I'm a lobsterman. They say I'm fisherman. Usually the fishermen stake out a section bottom where they commonly fish by the town. So the Islesboro fishermen actually fish quite south of Islesboro, and the guys from Stockton Springs fish off the east side of Islesboro. It's an interesting thing. But if anybody gets too close in on somebody else's territory, a warning signal is that they pick up all of the buoys, the same color, same pattern, and they pull them all together, they wrap a line around them, and they throw it back in the water, and it's called a bouquet. And it's a big, broad hint to get out of there. And it makes an awful mess of the line, and guys lose, they lose their traps. It's a big expense, so it really pays to watch where you're setting your traps. With any luck, with this kind of self-regulation, the fishery should last a while. Yeah, there's always the marine resource people that come in and say, well, has the coast all divided up into regions, and they'll curtail fishing in a certain section for a while, and the fishermen all grouse about what scientists don't know and all that, and say, well, we're on the water all the time and we know what's there. But then the scientists say, yeah, well, you have too much interest in all this, and I can be more objective, and so it goes, knocking heads. But it turns out it's a well-regulated fishery, and I should think it's good for a few more years. The really big concern is that lobsters often subsisted on the young of cod and some other bottom-feeding species, and those are getting rarer and rarer. And so the big concern really has to do with whether it can be sustained for those kinds of reasons. And global warming may very well have, global weirding may very well have some effect on that. So it bears watching, but cross fingers.
I assume you've heard the term mud roach to refer, and
Mud roach, yes.
I'm assuming that that's some sort of, not an urban myth, but a maritime myth, and I would
Yeah, it
appreciate
is sort
your
of,
thoughts.
yeah. Mud roach, yeah, bugs. Yeah, they'll say, oh, let's get us some bugs.
I have a very basic question. When people were describing what it was like eating a lobster, the ones that didn't like them, it sounded to me like they didn't know how to cook them properly. They're very touchy little guys. You have to cook them just a short amount of time or you ruin them.
Yeah, that's right.
So I think some of them, that was what happened, and that's why they were so unhappy.
Yeah, that could very well be that they just overcooked them and they didn't like them.
When they scanned the lobster meat and they sent it, all over the country, was that considered an expensive thing to buy?
Yeah.
Really
It was
expensive.
a luxury item.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. I mean, compared to something like salt codfish, or depending on where in the country you are, any of the freshwater species that people would fish in great quantity were very cheap compared to these wonderful little canned things. Yeah, this was a special treat, these lovely little cans of lobster.
Following up on the last question, my mom years ago had a friend who summered on Block Island, and she said that you should never throw lobster into a boiling pot of water. You had to steam them.
Yeah.
Have you heard that? And is
Oh,
there
yeah.
truth to that?
There are more conversations about how to cook a lobster. There's the steaming school and the boiling school, and there's ways of cooking a lobster that require that you take a live lobster, turn it over, go whack with your knife, and then put it in a pan to cook it. Well, I'm not quite man enough or woman enough to do that myself. And I'm just squeamish enough about lobsters that I use the boil water method, and then I grab it like this and I stick it in head first like this, because I hope that it'll kill whatever it's got for a teeny brain, which is not much. It's got a very little brain. And of course, the lobsters do what all creatures do after they've been murdered, and that is they thrash a bit. I mean, that's nerve reactions, and it can be a little unnerving to listen to the. I usually cook them in my big enamel canner, and they go bang, bang, bang in there, and I'm thinking, stop. I mean, and when I do a lobster bake, it's a little unnerving. I mean, they do crawl out from time to time and race down the beach, come back here, you know, stick it back in there, pile some more seaweed on top. And I mean, I hardly blame them. I mean, they're sentient enough to try to save their own lives. But there's more ways of. And some people will say, well, you can't only cook it for, time it for. But I'm thinking, well, it depends. If you got a soft shell, they cook it in a jiff. I mean, as soon as the water, how when you're cooking pasta and some other kinds of things, shrimp and stuff, once it boils up and it kind of goes foam over, I turn the heat off and I pull them out right then and there. Because if you cook a soft shell much longer than that, you're going to end up with shoe leather. So I keep it short. Hard shells takes longer.
Sandy, is lobster meat canned today?
Is lobster meat?
Is lobster meat canned today?
Yeah, I think it is actually. Gosh, that's a good question. I'm trying to think if I've seen any lately, canned lobster meat. They're making more money by taking fresh lobster and packing it cryovac kind of seal, in the vacuum packing, and freezing it so that you can get, that's the more favored way of doing it. And what's really interesting is that New England, I don't know what's wrong with our lobstermen just want to go fishing, and they don't want to have to mess with buyers. They don't want to mess with the public. They like to go over to the buyer's truck. They like to sell the load of lobster. They like to buy their bait and go home, and they don't want to talk to anybody about it. They just want to, they fish because they like being on the water, and they don't have to relate to anybody except their stern man, and their family when they go home. So and for some reason in New England, we're not doing a very good job of the value-added stuff. And Canada is cleaning our clock. An awful lot of our lobster gets sold up to Canada, and it's picked, just packed, distributed, turned into products, and sold back to America. It's nuts. Linda Bean, I know, is trying to reverse that somewhat, but why we haven't engaged more in our own value-added stuff, I really don't know. But I think it has something to do with the nature of our fishermen, too.
First of all, you did a really great job addressing all the things that we've heard about lobsters before. Mm-hmm. But there was one more thing that I had heard about lobsters that you didn't address, and maybe it's not relevant here, but I've heard that no one really knows how long lobsters live. And I was curious if you know anything about the lifespan of lobsters.
I'm trying to think I don't know that. I'm trying to think about that myself. There's a wonderful little book that's been published by Down East, written by Virginia Wright, and published by Down East, that is just about everything you need to know about lobster, including their whole sex life. It's all laid out there, and she may very well deal with that. Now, it seems to me that I read in some of the early literature that the stories were told that lobsters live as long as 100 years. I don't know about that, but they don't. Most of them won't get to live that long. There'll be a few that get by and manage to have long, distinguished careers. But I don't know. I'll try to find out, though. But it was awfully nice of you to turn out tonight. I really enjoyed talking with you all.
Yes, thank you.